You're into your third or second interview with the defendant, is that correct?
Yes, yes, I am.
Would you resume where you were? Do you know where you were precisely?
Yes, I do.
Would you please resume? This is in the second interview. It's here in the safety building in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it's a 1023-91, and you're in a building, in a room not far from where we are presently. Is that correct?
That's true.
All right. Would you and the defendant are alone, and you're continuing your examination of him. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Would you please proceed?
I then talked about, quote, acidifying, A-C-I-D-I-F-Y-I-N-G, unquote. He had two 30-gallon barrels, and he used acid, and he would make the body parts into what he called, quote, sludge, and then flush this down the toilet. He said he, quote, gave up, unquote, on using trash bags. He said he disposed of the body parts in part half through trash bags and about half through the acid flush routine. He said that if the sludge barrel was full, he would then use a trash bag for flesh. He would not put bones in a trash bag, however, and there was too much of a chance for them to be discovered. He said, quote, they wouldn't decompose, so I put all the bones in the acid, unquote. In the trash bag, he would just put fist-sized chunks of flesh. If I didn't have room in the barrel, cut in small pieces, 25 pounds in each bag, 3 bags per pickup, all triple bagged, unquote. He said 3 trash bags would take care of all the flesh. He would triple bag to, quote, ensure there wouldn't be breakage, unquote. In conclusion, he said that 11 victims were, quote, acidified, unquote. He kept one skeleton, quote, one of the more attractive ones, which was Miller, and his skeleton dried out so well, unquote. He said the 2 acidifying barrels were in the hallway closet. He also had an 80-gallon pot for cleaning heads, and he would add Soilex, S-O-I-L-E-X. He said this was the same material used for removing wallpaper. He was able to use the body for sexual purposes for a couple days, and during that time he would take pictures, quote, to remember that what they looked like. The physique was the main attraction, to remember them, to use the pictures later to masturbate. Then the time came to get rid of the body, and the labor, L-A-B-O-R, labor begins, unquote. Again, confirming that the cleanup, the disposal was not a sexually motivated act. Would put the body in a bathtub, and and he described how he dismembered and cut, and how he would deflesh. He would put parts into a trash bag, or if he was going to acidify, he would put them directly into the barrel, which was alongside the bathtub, apparently. He always saved the head and would put it in the freezer. I think he said a 5 cubic foot freezer. He bought it at a store in a particular mall, quote, for the storing of body parts, unquote. This was bought 2 months after the first victim at his third residence, which he thought was Cash D.
Doctor, just at one point, I don't think you quoted exactly what he would do when you put the body in the bathtub.
Well, that was on purpose.
Right, would you do that?
He would cut down the front to the pelvic area, then cut up the organs and deflesh the bones.
Did he say at that time he would do anything particular to the body? Did he add anything other? Did you make note of what he said at that point? Were you making notes of that?
That's what he told me, what I just read to you.
Did he tell you anything further with respect to what he would do when he would slit the body down from the sternum to the pelvic area?
No, he did not. Not at this point, anyway.
Would you proceed?
When asked, he said, quote, I have been doing so many horrible things that I became desensitized, which was his word. I was completely desensitized. It didn't bother me. It had to be done to dispose of the remains. The ambassador incident was a mistake. I had to rush around to make sure it wasn't discovered, meaning the ambassador incident. The only way I knew how to dispose of it, I couldn't leave a whole body in the trunk. He implied that the cutting up bothered him the first time. It got progressively easier to do. It implied that the Hicks and the ambassador Tommy incident were harder to do. And then he got...
Excuse me, doctor, would you reread what you just said? Or harder to do or hard to do?
It got progressively easier to do. Hicks and the ambassador incident were hard to do.
Thank you.
It was just part of the procedure, and he agreed with me that a human being can adapt to anything, like shooting people in combat.
Doctor, I'd like to ask your question too at this point. As part of your medical training program, your own passage through medical school, there is a course that involves the assignment of a cadaver to you as a student. Is that correct?
Freshman anatomy.
Yes. And every medical student goes through that program. Is that correct? Is it natural the first time that even when you're cutting a cadaver in medical school, for some people it's difficult to do? Is that correct?
Oh, I think it's a natural reaction to get over the squeamishness, and yeah, very definitely that was a thing you had to become desensitized to, and
Does that
see it in a more professional perspective and change your orientation in order to do it.
I would object at this time to the analogy because it is not a matter here. We're dealing only with dead people. Cadavers are people that are delivered who are already dead, and I think it's unfair to use this analogy. Objection.
Well, I just want to point out the issue of
I think whatever point was to be made has been made. Let's go on to the next question.
Would you continue, Doctor?
He said the bones always went into the acid barrel, except for the skeleton he saved. He put this into the kettle and removed the flesh and cleaned the bones and, quote, laid them out to dry, unquote. He said he would try to do one body at a time, one barrel for the bones and one for the flesh. Would soak for about 2 weeks in the acid solution, and then would take the barrels into the bathroom and used a plastic scooper. It took about a half hour to empty the barrel into the toilet, and it used about 10 flushes. The toilet never clogged. He would then rinse and clean out the barrels. I asked him if he wasn't getting some overlap between his victims, and he said that towards the end there was an overlap. He mentioned the deaf-mute and the Laotian overlapped, and the black individual he met at 27th Street and Weinberger overlap. He put their flesh in trash bags. He never had two sets of body parts in the same acid barrel. When asked why they overlapped, he said, quote, I didn't have the time or energy to deflesh them, unquote. Until he got around to defleshing them, in these later cases, he put the body into his bathtub with a bleach water solution, quote, to keep the smell down, unquote. He then picked up his next victim, and when he defleshed this victim, he would deflesh the previous victim. He did them both together. When asked, he said the latter victim would not know that there was a body in the tub. And he agreed with me that he, quote, got lazy, unquote, which were his words about properly disposing of the bodies.
Doctor, did he at any time in your discussion with him about what the disposal business ever talk about engaging in a ritual of any type as he dismembered these bodies?
No, he did not.
Would you continue?
Said a second to last victim, Weinberger, was dead for about a week, and he kept him in the bathtub in the bleach water solution, quote, to keep the smell down and keep them preserved until I could deflesh them, unquote. After he used his last victim for sexual purposes for a couple days, he then disposed of he and Weinberger at the same time. He had two bodies kept in the tub in this manner in the bleach water solution. When asked if he ever took a bath, he said he took showers and he would drain the tub and shower with the body in the tub, and he showered about 3 times a week. When asked, he said he was employed on a regular basis and worked until his second to last victim, and this is a victim that he called in sick and lost his job. He He said the deaths of the 12 victims were spread out over 2 years, and 6 were in 1991. He said that after the third or fourth victim, the dismembering and the defleshing, quote, became pretty automatic, unquote. When asked, again said that 2 or 3 individuals at grandmother's woke up and left or were let go. There were also 2 or 3 such individuals at his last residence.
That's the residence at 25th and Kilburn where the 12 other people were slain?
Yes. He said the, quote, the urge was to keep them with me, to masturbate and play with them. This override any normal hesitation to have second thoughts about killing them, unquote. And my interpretation is that his desire for sexual pleasure overrode the taking of life issue, which I had discussed with him previously. If I may elaborate on that, we had discussed, what's wrong with you, and the issue is that to do what he was doing, there's this balance between his sexual pleasure and the life of the other individual, and to sacrifice somebody for your sexual pleasure, that desire overrode the whatever value he had about taking of life. Again, when asked what was wrong with him, he said, quote, an inability to make moral and rational decisions and to resist the sexual lust I had. It canceled out all normal, rational thoughts, unquote. On an earlier interview, he did mention that somebody does make a 151 proof rum, and I kind of doubted it. Then I asked him again, and he said, yes, indeed, this company does make a 151 proof rum. And said he usually drank it, and the victims commonly drank decaffeinated coffee and Irish cream. He said, quote, it's expensive, referring to the Irish cream, but tastes good. The hot coffee would dissolve the pill, unquote. He never told me about grinding up pills beforehand. He would usually drink rum and Coke. He said the victim was usually intoxicated and that both he and the victim had usually been drinking, which again reflects the, what I think is very important, the contribution of alcohol to the dissolution of control. Drinking earlier in the evening and before taking the sleeping mixture. And I shared with him that it was pretty unwise and reckless to give anyone who was intoxicated sleeping pills, and he agreed with that. He said that he almost killed one of his partners earlier while experimenting at the bathhouse. He almost killed him with a sleeping potion. He gave him 5 tablets, and then the person didn't respond in the morning sufficiently. Called the EMS to the bathhouse, and Mr. Dahmer actually rode with the individual in the ambulance to the hospital. And I asked what they decided, and he said that the hospital thought the individual had drank too much. Again, when discussing the disregard for human life issue, he said he, quote, viewed them as objects, strangers. If I knew them, I could not have done it. Also the alcohol. So here he's saying that he could have refrained or conformed his conduct if they were not objects or strangers to him, and that simply knowing them better would have helped his control, and that he could not have done it had he been more personally involved with them. That relates to the control conformity issue, suggests that this was a factor. He said that both he and the individual he picked up had been drinking, and they both would feel somewhat intoxicated. They would return to his apartment and drink there, usually beer or rum. He was usually intoxicated when he gave them the sleeping mixture. A couple times he was somewhat sober, and I'm asking these questions, somewhat sober when he gave them the mixture. He had drank earlier, but he did not necessarily always feel intoxicated. He said, quote, I need about a 6-pack to get buzzed, unquote. He would continue to drink beer after they were drugged and passed out, or would drink the 151 proof rum before and after the victim passed out. More commonly, he would just drink beer. When asked, he said he used a nylon strap to choke the last 5 or 6 victims. He said it was, quote, quicker, unquote. He bought it for strangulation purposes. He killed 3 or 4 of them when he was feeling somewhat sober. He said, quote, it made it a little more difficult, unquote, meaning that being more sober made it harder to do, which, let's say his conscience was more intact when he was sober. When he strangled the others, he was, quote, somewhat drunk, and he was not bothered, except for the ambassador case. Then I asked, and he said he did not blame alcohol and was not attributing his behavior to alcohol. He said, quote, it, referring to the alcohol, just put me in a better mood. It made me feel, it increased the lustful desire. It removes inhibitions, unquote. And what that means is that alcohol does remove inhibitions, as most of us know, and we can do and say things while intoxicated that we would not do sober. Again, when discussing his attitude about the life of the victims and what was wrong with him, he said, quote, the lustful desire overpowered any normal moral choices, meaning that his lust, being a strong sexual desire, overpowered his normal sense of decisions made by his conscience. When asked about why his sex drive should be so strong as to overcome his conscience, so to speak, he said, quote, a consuming interest, the only thing that gave me any sense of fulfillment and satisfaction, a continuous urge, relentless is a good way to put it, for physical pleasure and sensation, unquote. And he agreed that he was often having several orgasms a day. He said he spent, quote, thousands, unquote, of dollars on videos and pornography. Estimated he owned about 30 videotapes and, quote, countless, unquote, magazines, which raises the issue of outside external influences on his behavior, the issue of being influenced by what you read and see, that he was in fact being influenced by what he was reading and seeing, that this was a contributory factor that helped him participate in these offenses. He said, quote, I just like the ones that showcase the physique, unquote. And he mentioned some places where he got the materials, such as the 27th Street bookstore, the J&R News, and the Denmark, which he said burned down. When asked if pornography and the videos caused his behavior, he said, quote, they fueled it, definitely fueled the desire, unquote. He said the videos and the magazines kept him aroused and stimulated, quote, but not the cause. It does desensitize a person, unquote, meaning that the more you watch of something, you can also get accustomed to it. Maybe this is going on with all of us. The more you hear about what he did, day one it's very shocking. Maybe by week 2, we're all becoming desensitized to.
It's over there. My kid said it was over. Been over. Travel been over.
He said he did.
Excuse me, since
Continue.
I didn't understand what he said, I don't make any motion. So, we can continue.
If anybody did, they should disregard it. Go ahead.
He said he did not watch any videos or magazines depicting homicidal behavior. He said the most violent material we ever saw was, quote, playful bondage in pictures. I'm not into anything sadistic, tying, whipping, or burning, unquote. He then said that this happened to him one time. He was passed out from drinking and, quote, hogtied, unquote, The man that picked him up was sticking a candle, quote, you know where, unquote, and this burned Mr. Dahmer's thigh. The scar eventually left, and this happened while on pass from work release. He said he always had the fear of getting caught by the police. He knew he was engaging in criminal and illegal behavior. Quote, the desire was strong enough that it didn't matter. Desire warps your thinking that you can't find any peace or rest, unquote. When asked what was so pleasurable to keep on doing this, he said, quote, to feel their body and physique and masturbate and have an orgasm, unquote. He said he worked during those 2 years, and all this activity was weekend behavior. During the week at home, he would watch videos, use the pictures he had taken, masturbate using the skulls, and do disposal or cleanup work. Sometimes he would do cleanup work on weekends. And that was the end of of that interview.
When was the next time that you met with Mr. Dahmer?
On December 20th, 1991.
Do you recall where that was, or do your notes indicate where that was?
That was at the Columbia Correctional Institution, and lasted from 11:30 to 4:30 for 5 hours.
Is that a facility somewhat north of Madison, the city of Madison?
Yes, it's a short hour north of Madison.
And you drove up there that day, and arrangements were made, and you met with Mr. Dahmer, is that correct?
That's true.
Were you alone, or was there some guard in attendance, if you recollect?
There were guards in the hallway, but
The room in which you met?
no, it was private.
Just you and Mr. Dahmer met?
That's the way it always was.
I'm sorry?
That's the way it always was. I was always alone with him. There were guards either in this building or at Columbia Correctional. There was a personnel in the hallway.
Okay. And then you also undertook then to interview him in the same fashion that you had earlier interviewed. Is that correct?
That's true.
And you have notes of that interview with you?
That's true.
Would you proceed telling the jury about it?
Again, certainly part of the impetus for this interview was that the previous interview certainly was more of a general nature, and I had not specifically obtained a comment or statement from him about each of the cases, which I felt was necessary, because considering he was being charged with these cases, and at least for my report and trial, I should at least have a comment from him on each of the victims.
The first two paragraphs relate to discussions about procedures that were underway, various legal measures. Is that correct?
That's true.
And would you then start with the third paragraph?
He said over the years he has forgotten the names of some of the victims, and they would just use their first names. Quote, it was standard procedure to keep things impersonal. Don't ask a lot of personal questions, just small talk, unquote. He said there were 3 victims at grandmother's, and 3 individuals were not killed there, but left from her residence. When asked how he felt after the Dock Stater homicide, he said he was, quote, surprised that I was doing it again. It fueled my desire. It was too late to stop. It was on my mind during the week to pick up and keep them permanently. I was in too deep of trouble, so it didn't matter. I think that's accurate. Too far past that point. And he denied attempts to stop or self-reform at that point. And I asked him about that, and he implied that, pretty much like he said, once you can get so deep in the trouble that more crimes, it doesn't matter. You know, I'm past that point.
And that was the Dock Stater incident. This is the first incident after the Twomey incident. Is that correct?
That's true. And he said he was in too deep of trouble, so it didn't matter. And with that attitude, I think this is a contributing factor which facilitated his continuing. If you think this way and one more bank robbery doesn't matter, I'll keep on doing them. I can't get into any more trouble, so to speak. We then talked about Richard Guerrero.
This was the victim that followed Mr. Dockstader. It's the second one at the grandmother's house, is that correct? Second where life was actually taken at the grandmother's house.
Met him at the entrance to the Phoenix Bar on Water Street. Had not seen him before. Guerrero was leaving the bar. Mr. Dahmer had a six-pack with him, and it was closing time. Said it was on the, quote, spur of the moment, unquote. They got together, approached him and talked about sex in the video, offered him money, but did not pay him. Guerrero was Hispanic, about 5'10", and appeared, quote, attractive, unquote. Said he asked him only because he was attractive. Said he would not have approached him if he was fat or bald. The two of them took a bus to grandmother's, and he was feeling, quote, fairly drunk, unquote. Said he drank from about 10 until 2 a.m. And then I asked him what his evening routine was, and he said before 10 o'clock he would be, quote, relaxing, unquote, at home. He did not go out from 7 to 11 because some individuals would not be wanting to leave at that time. So at home, so therefore if you start at 10 to 2, then you're, if you want to take somebody home, you adjust your schedule so that you have to start later. If you start earlier, then you're at the bar too long and no one's leaving at 11. He did not go out from 7 to 11 because some individuals would not be wanting to leave at that time. At home, he and Guerrero took their clothes off, laid on the bed together for about an hour. He said he kept the sound down low so he would not wake up grandmother, and I'm not sure what sound he was talking about. They were upstairs in his bedroom. They went downstairs and made a coffee and Irish cream mix and added 4 or 5 tablets. Gave it to Guerrero, and he drank it and fell asleep. Guerrero said he had to leave about 5 a.m. And Mr. Dahmer did not go to sleep. Said he found this individual very attractive and knew that he would kill him to, quote, keep him permanently, unquote. Grandmother would wake up around 7 a.m. and go to church around 11:50 a.m. Took Mr. Guerrero to the basement that morning and, quote, before she came back, grandmother from church, unquote, before she came back, unquote, I'm referring to grandmother coming back from church. He did not dispose of Dockstader for about 1 week, but he did Guerrero right away. Quote, it was too big of a risk to keep him all week, unquote. Too big of a risk to keep Guerrero there in the house all week. He kept the skull and used Soilix at grandmother's that morning. Prompt disposal of Guerrero. Said it was, quote, too stressful having Dockstader there all week, and he was worried about being discovered, which reflects the appreciation of wrongfulness issue. He kept Guerrero because he was, quote, very attractive, unquote. He disposed of the body in 2 hours, 3 25-pound bags, flesh and bones, triple bagged, put in the Monday morning trash. And he said that Monday morning he watched from his a bedroom window to make sure nothing went awry, unquote. Meaning he watched the trash pickup. When asked, he said he was concerned about the parts being discovered later in the trash. But, well, quote, but there is so much tonnage, and apparently that worked, unquote, meaning that there's so much trash picked up that the Monday morning system was effective, and he never got in trouble for doing it that way. He usually drank less at grandmother's, Irish cream and coffee only. She did not have liquor in the home. He had Irish cream in his closet. He knew he would only be able to use his sexuality. He knew he would only be able to use him sexually after he was killed for a few hours, talking about Guerrero, because grandmother would be getting up. He got up with her that Sunday morning. The body was left on his bed in his bedroom. He had breakfast with grandmother, and she never went into his bedroom. And he said, quote, to be with her and appear normal, unquote. He said he was, quote, halfway drunk, unquote. This is earlier in the evening. 6 to 8 beers at the bar. He felt sober the next morning, however. He kept the skull, cut up his clothes into small pieces, put them in the trash Monday morning. He used the body for sexual purposes until grandmother woke up that Sunday morning. He masturbated while he looked at the body and touched the body, and there was no anal sex. He said, quote, knew it was horribly dangerous, was taking a horrible risk, but the desire was there and no other source of satisfaction in my life, unquote. He admitted that there was some mental struggle as to whether or not to take Guerrero's life. He later moved into his 24th Street efficiency apartment for 2 months. He met the Laotian, took pictures of him for $50, pictures in his underwear, and gave him the sleeping potion. He did not fall asleep, and the victim left and went home and possibly passed out at home, and then later told his parents. Mr. Dahmer was arrested around 1 a.m. and spent 6 hours in the county jail. The police...
6 days, I think it's 6 days.
6 days in the county jail. The police searched his apartment, and they did not find the skull. And he said he only had one skull there, Guerrero. He admitted to me that he was, quote, holding his breath, unquote, that he's worried about the police, them finding something, and he was worried about, quote, a second search, unquote. One skull was the only concern he had about what the police might find. He was later placed on bond and moved back in with his grandmother. He was charged with enticing a child for immoral purposes, and after being on bond, he then disposed of the skull and said, quote, it was too dangerous to keep it, meaning to get discovered. He was then examined by Dr. Lodell. He went on trial and was sentenced to 1 year with work release. 3 months later, he started his 1 year at the Huber dorm. During those 3 months, he met Anthony Sears.
Just the 3 months before preceding his sentencing date?
From what I recall, this is what, 3 months before he starts his work release and 3 months after Guerrero. Is that correct?
About, yeah.
A gay bar on 2nd and National at closing time, when asked, said that during that time he still had desires during the 3 months interlude, but there was too much, quote, legal activity going on, so he just used pornography and videotapes, and so at least he was exercising some restraint during that time, but did not find that fulfilling. On the way out of the tavern around 2:30 in the morning, he started up a conversation with Sears. Quote, he was very willing to go back, and quote, got a ride in Sears' friend's car. Sears was black. He said race did not matter, quote, just so they're good looking. Color does not make any difference, unquote. He said had he not found anybody attractive, he just would then have gone home. He got a ride with Sears' friend. Mr. Dahmer and Sears were in the back seat. Sears was giving Mr. Dahmer a blowjob in the back seat. They were both, quote, fairly drunk, unquote. They got out of 57th and Lincoln, I think, and walked 2 blocks to grandmother's house. He would ask his victims how long they could stay. Sears said he had to be back by 7 a.m. He said Sears was very, quote, special, unquote. Made him coffee and Irish whiskey in the kitchen, and then went to the bedroom and they, quote, played around, unquote, kissing and masturbation. Sears passed out, and then he was strangled. Mr. Dahmer strangled him with his hands. He said he wanted a, quote, memento, a keepsake, unquote. Then I asked him, and he agreed that he had a disregard for their life. He said he would not have done it had he known them. They were strangers to him. Quote, I blanked it out of my thinking, the ultimate in selfishness, not considering someone else, unquote. Then I asked him further, and he implied that selfishness has always been a trait of his, but not perhaps a, quote, blatant, unquote, trait, just in my thought processes, unquote. He could not give me any particular historical examples about how he was particularly selfish with other people. We discussed the choice balance between his sexual pleasure and the individual's life. He strangled Sears and left him on the bed. Grandmother got up and later went to church, laid with Sears for about 1 hour and had anal intercourse. He said a dead victim was not as good as a live one. Quote, the best you could hope for under these circumstances, unquote. He agreed that he had been living in his apartment, that had he been living in his apartment, he might have tried to keep a relationship with Sears going. Quote, he was very special, unquote. So that tells me that perhaps he might have been able to refrain from killing some of these people if he could have started a relationship with them, and that the possibility of a relationship would have facilitated his control, and he would have been able to refrain. Grandmother was gone about 4 hours. It was Easter time. He used the body, kept the skull with flesh on it, preserved the head in a bucket of acetone, bought the acetone on Monday for this purpose, quote, to dress down, unquote, the flesh and keep it preserved. He had called a taxidermist and asked how to preserve a rabbit head. He soaked the skull in solution for 1 week after the brain was removed, and he said this was hard to do. And he talked about removing the first vertebrae and how he removed the contents of the skull, and that he worked on it all Monday in his bedroom, but, quote, made sure the bedroom door was locked, unquote, when he went to work on the third shift. He kept the skull with the flesh on it for 1 week in a bucket in the closet. He then drained off the acetone and said the skull and flesh were preserved well. He kept it out of solution for 1 week, dried it out, would masturbate when he looked at it, also preserved the penis and testicles. And he said, when asked, the size of the penis was not important to him. He said this particular skull later became, quote, mummified, unquote. He kept it and bought a cosmetic case and put the skull in the case. He eventually had to start his work release program, so he put the case in his locker at work, and it was there for 9 months. Combination locker, he did not worry about somebody finding the head because he had a combination lock. When asked, he said as long as the trash was picked up on a Monday, and he's still at grandmother's, he worried less. And he said that if the trash bags were at the curb for several days and there was a later in the week pickup at grandmother's, that would have caused him problems. He said Sears was, very, quote, very nice looking, unquote. When asked, said the genitals were, quote, for a keepsake for display purposes, unquote, at his apartment. He mentioned having bought a, quote, black lacquered podium, unquote, in his bedroom. He did not have any guests, and he agreed it would have been rather shocking to see a penis and testicles on display. After finishing his work release, he did not see the suitcase for 9 months. A Sears skull became moldy. He cleaned the flesh out and kept the skull and genitals. And when asked, he agreed that the skull and the genitals were more for, quote, historical, unquote, interest. The genitals were not used for stimulation or masturbation purposes. Instead, he would go to bookstores for magazines and videos for stimulation purposes. He said he spent thousands on, unquote, on pornographic materials, again suggesting a possible contributory influence on his behavior. He said he was able to keep the various victims fairly separate. In his discussion, when asked, he said Sears was, quote, one of the best so far, in the top 3, unquote, and Sears was the last victim at grandmother's residence. He then made the comment that, quote, I've never heard voices. I want to purge myself of everything, meaning confess to everything. He said that he was sentenced to his work release program about a month after killing Sears. When asked what he was doing with his desires during that time, he said that he was just using pornography, saw some other men, but did not find them attractive, so he did not approach them. Again, the screening function of being attractive. He continued to go out, this is before starting work release, and went to the Chicago bath clubs, but only for one-night stands. He then said that, quote, the quote, ideal situation, unquote, would have been to have a, quote, a home and a regular lover, unquote, reflecting again that the tragic substitute patterns he was into were what I would consider substitute sexual behavior, not his first choice. Then clarified a misunderstanding that I had and said that most of the gay people do have a steady lover, but that he did not. And he described himself as, quote, pretty much of a loner in the middle of a crowd, unquote, in the crowd of his other gay men. Said that he was somewhat in the, quote, middle, unquote, as far as desirability goes, was not considered completely undesirable, and was approached by other men, was also not considered the best catch. I asked what the, quote, best catches for him would have been, and he said male dancers, quote, the best looking, the Chippendale look, unquote, and he informed me that these were the touring male strippers for ladies' shows. He said, quote, looks are everything. I was very shallow in my desires, unquote, and then again said that the majority of gay men are paired off. At the bars, said he would drink and scan, quote, scan the crowd, unquote. He did not dance, he did little talking. When asked, he said he had friends at work, but did not go out with them, did not have any social life, just the bars and the bathhouses. Admitted that he was feeling lonely, agreed that had more interaction with people, he might have had less homosexual, homicidal urges. This reflects on his personality makeup, this paragraph, that he certainly has trouble forming relationships, tends towards social withdrawal, has what we call schizoid, S-C-H-I-Z-O-I-D, personality disorder traits. Later in my interview, and we discussed that perhaps had he been more into bonding with people, forming relationships, that none of this might have happened. After being released from work release, he lived back at grandmother's for a few months, and he did not commit any more homicides. Then moved into a new apartment for a couple months and continued going to bars. He was in the release program, work release program, from about 689 to 390. Was at grandmother's again for 3 months, and then moved into his own apartment in the summer of 1990. When asked about the apparent lapse between victims Sears and Smith, he said that during that, quote, dry spell, unquote, he continued to engage in pornography and attend bath clubs only in Chicago, one-night stands, no more homicides, and said that he was not going to get into this type of behavior again until he had his own apartment. So he was waiting on that. He was refraining from any further such behavior until he had a place of his own.
That period stretched from the slaying of Sears from March 26, 1989 until at or about May 20th of 1990, which is just a few days short of 14 months. Would you comment on that in connection with the issue relating to control?
Well, draw whatever inferences you want. It's certainly his sexual maladjustment disorder was certainly there, and he certainly had the interests were there, but he had the capacity to refrain and control and to wait. 2 months later, in the summer of 1990, he met Raymond Smith, or quote, Cash D, unquote, a black man, quote, attractive, a male hustler, unquote. Met after closing time, offered him money. Smith was waiting to get picked up. Told Dahmer he was a male hustler, not gay. told Dahmer, quote, "If no money, no sex," unquote. Mr. Dahmer offered him $50. Smith wanted $100, and Smith agreed to wait to get money until Mr. Dahmer could get money from the bank the next day. Gave Mr. Smith the drink mixture. He then said that about a month prior to this, he got his coffee cups mixed up, and that he, Mr. Dahmer, drank the drug coffee and passed out, and then was robbed of $300. And he said, quote, "The tables were turned," unquote. And he had used about 5 tablets in that particular concoction. Getting back to Smith, he was passed out, strangled him and laid with him for a few hours, put him on the black table, took about 20 pictures, did not consider trying to get him to remain voluntarily because he knew he was not gay and not interested in a relationship. Quote, "That was my modus operandi at that time. No struggle," referring to, I asked about, was there any struggle mentally killing him? "No struggle. My conscience was seared," S-E-A-R-E-D, unquote. Then implied that his conscience was, quote, "seared," unquote, after the ambassador case, and said he drank 151 proof with that victim, Mr. Tomey, and had no intentions of killing that victim. In regard to Cash D, said there was no particular internal struggle about killing him. Quote, "Just that area of my conscience that had no rule, R-U-L-E, at all. I just viewed them as objects. It made it easier. There was no malice at all. I didn't hate them. Otherwise, I would have tortured them. I tried to make it as painless as possible," unquote. So what we're talking about here is that his conscience, and I take his word for it, is becoming impaired. His sensitivity and values are becoming eroded because of what he's been doing. He said there was always some sort of sexual contact before the strangling, and he said the strangling was a means to an end. Afterwards, he felt a sense of control and power. Quote, "I could do whatever I wanted with them, and I didn't have to worry about what they were going to do," referring to leaving, etc. So again, reflecting on his motive for killing them. He had control of the situation, and he didn't have to worry about providing sexual reciprocation.
Would you skip the next paragraph?
Yes, I will.
I'm sorry.
He took pictures of Cash D on the table, 2 days of this.
Did you skip a sentence or two from that paragraph? I didn't mean to cut you off.
No,
No, I was going to skip that whole paragraph myself.
Good.
Took pictures of Cash D on the table, 2 days of this. Took him to the bathroom, did the defleshing and dismembering. The first one at his apartment, his third apartment. Put the flesh in trash bags and said there was a, quote, "huge," unquote, "dumpster in the back of the apartment building," quote, "so I didn't worry about the pickup day," unquote. In the confession, there's mention made that even though there was a huge dumpster, he apparently still hid the bag in the dumpster. Besides just having a big dumpster, he also specially located the bag in the dumpster. He wanted to keep the skeleton. He bought a large 80-gallon kettle at a restaurant supply store for cleaning the bones. He said he did not bury the remains. You know, I asked him why he didn't just bury the remains, and he said because of the apartment setting, meaning he lives in an apartment building and he doesn't have a big backyard type thing, or he doesn't live in the country. He used 4 boxes of Soilex and would boil the bones for a few hours and then rinse off the bones. They were very clean afterwards, and all the bones became unattached. He bought the Soilex at a hardware store. He had asked the taxidermist before and was told about Soilex. Put the bones in a container, soaked them in a bleach solution for about a day, then put them in the closet for a month to dry out. He had all the bones and was hoping to reassemble them. He said the body remained unusable for about 3 days. I'm sorry, remained usable for about 3 days for sexual purposes. He worked the Monday 11 p.m. shift. Then we returned home to get some sleep and continued to do the boiling work. And he agreed with me that he was getting quite proficient. He said the cash D case ended with a box of bones. The next case was Edward Smith, the quote Sheik unquote, in summer of 1990.
The nickname by which Mr. Smith was known, Sheik?
Sheik. Saw him at the Phoenix Bar around 1 a.m. Smith was dancing and, quote, caught my eye. I approached him and he was very willing, unquote. Took a taxi back to his apartment, did not know his real name, was called the Sheik because he wore a turban, never saw him before, quote, tall and nice looking, unquote. Gave him the mixture and strangled him. Took some pictures, quote, the same scenario, unquote. A week before, said he bought a floor freezer at a certain store in a certain mall to store bones that had flesh on them in case he was too tired to clean them afterwards. In the police confession, he also stated that the freezer was used in part to store parts for a while so that he would not dispose of a whole body at one time, but would dispose of the parts in smaller portions over time. He did not tell me that. He used the body for sexual purposes for a few days, and no anal intercourse with Kashti or the Sheik. Defleshed in the bathtub, cleaned the bones, second box in a hallway closet with the skulls. I then asked him about the camera, maybe being okay. And he said he bought a certain brand and gave me the brand of an Instamatic Polaroid. He did not own a camera before, but he bought it before the Cash D case. He said Cash D was the first to be photographed. He used a Polaroid camera so that he would not have to send the film out for processing. Quote, I didn't want to take the chance, unquote, meaning of being discovered through prints being processed. Bought the camera.
Does this have application to the wrongfulness issue?
Very definitely. Bought the camera 2 months after Sears. Said that having their bodies for sexual purposes was quite fulfilling. Quote, I could keep something and enjoy the control and the contact and not have to rush like in a bathhouse,
The
unquote.
next line you should not read, okay?
True. So again,
The
the
next...
control and to be able to control the circumstances of the lovemaking and not have to rush like in a bathhouse. Then mentioned LP.
The next person is being referred to as a minor as LP.
Fine.
Would you be kind enough to just go back right after when Mr. McCann says, don't read the next line, and read that answer, please.
Quote, I could keep something and enjoy the control and the contact and not have to rush like in a bathhouse, unquote.
That's what you said, and then Mr. McCann said, don't read the next line, then you said something else, and that's not written down, and that's...
Oh, I said I was not going to anyway.
I think you said something after that, too.
I have taken some editorial liberty here, but that I was
I
going
don't have any problems with what you...
No, that's fine.
I just didn't hear it. Would you
That's
read
fine.
the next thing I said after that, Madam Reporter, if there was?
I think this is what you want. Mr. McCann says, the next line you should not read, okay? Answer true. So again, controlling, to be able to control the circumstances of the lovemaking and not have to rush like in the bathhouse?
That next name, again, is a juvenile, so if you'd use the reference to LP.
And then mentioned LP. 1 month later, Hispanic, 15 years old, but he thought he was older. A busboy at the particular tavern. Had seen him before. And after closing time, offered him money, then took a cab back to the apartment, quote, laid around, unquote, for about 3 hours, LP said he would meet him the next evening. He had to get home early before his mother woke up. He did not give LP the drink mixture. He agreed to meet him at 12 noon. So this is an individual that was let go because of future plans. LP was not there, and then Mr. Dahmer returned at 12 midnight, and he was there. So there was some confusion over the meeting time. He had bought a rubber mallet at an Army surplus store. They returned to the apartment, and pictures were taken. He did not know how to keep him. He had him lie on his stomach for a pose, hit him in the back of the neck with a rubber mallet to knock him out, and he was going to try the mallet instead of sleeping pills. It did not work, and LP got dressed and threatened to call the police and left. LP returned later and asked for money to use the phone. There was a phone 3 blocks away. Mr. Dahmer thought he was going to call the police, asked Mr. Dahmer for a couple dollars change. Mr. Dahmer assumed he was going to call the police, so he grabbed him in and or near the apartment doorway. He admitted that he attempted to strangle and kill him at that moment. He did not want LP to call the police. Then they started talking, and he talked him out of calling the police. He said, which, you know, they're talking police, they're talking wrongfulness. Obviously, wrongfulness is on his mind. Mr. Dahmer then walked him to a cab stand at 7 a.m. and gave him some cab money home. Said LP did call the police, but told the police that he was hit on Water Street and carried back to the apartment. The police did not believe him. And Mr. Dahmer was never questioned, was not charged, and he agreed with me that he, quote, lucked out, unquote, period. Found the next individual at the 27th Street bookstore, did not recall his name. I think it's Mr. Ernest Miller. True?
Yes, sir.
At 3 a.m., after closing time, he was on his way to the bookstore to buy some pornography, then said he was involved with more white men than black men. He approached Miller on the street, offered him money, quote, tall and muscular, unquote. Miller agreed and Mr. Dahmer knew he would kill him. Gave him the drink mixture. Then he said he did not have any pills available in regard to LP. But since the LP episode, he had made an appointment with his doctor, said he couldn't sleep, and obtained a small refill, only 2 or 3 tablets. He did not know Miller was from Chicago, returned to the apartment, and only had 3 pills. Miller became slightly drugged, found Miller, quote, definitely attractive, unquote, and wanted to keep him. He used a knife and punctured the carotid artery. Quote, he was unconscious, comma, but if I tried to strangle him, he would have woken up. 1 neat stab wound and died quickly, unquote. Stabbed him on his bed, much blood on the bed, most of the blood soaked in between the mattresses. And he talked about cleaning it and throwing out the sheets. And he said he wanted him because he was, quote, so attractive, unquote. Took pictures on the table in various poses and would use these pictures for masturbation purposes later. And then I asked him, and he said his pictures were as good, if not better, for masturbation purposes than the ones he bought. He said the body was useful for about 3 days, kept the body on the bed or on the table when he was at work.
Again, useful for what purpose would the body be useful?
For sexual purposes. Said he would have a normal night of work. He got his job done. When I asked him about if this was interfering with his work. And he agreed with me that he was certainly leading a double life. He said that killing, quote, got so routine, unquote, that he was able to concentrate on his work. Again, this is an attitude, this is a desensitization, and certainly helps explain why he killed them. He said that, quote, on purpose, he did not ask them who they were so that he would not get to know them, quote, so that they were objects, unquote. Let's see who we're on. We're still talking about Miller. After the third night, he took the body to the bathroom, did half the dismembering, and then had to go to work. The next morning, the manager stopped him in regard to a complaint about a bad smell. The police were called and checked the wrong apartment. Said the police had actually kicked in the wrong door trying to find the smell. Because of this, he then finished his cleanup job before he went to work that night. Then he said he kept various organs and muscles. He rinsed them off for later consumption, and he put them in clean bags, the first time he had ever done this. He said he did this out of, quote, curiosity to see what they tasted like, unquote. Later felt that after eating them, they then became, quote, part of me, unquote. Then he described the various parts he kept, and he said he put them in gallon freeze bags, 50 to 75 bags, 1 to 2 pounds per bag. First time he'd ever done this. There was nothing in the freezer before, but now the freezer was full. 3 boxes with bones were now in the closets. He said he prepared about 6 meals with the body parts. And then said that about 1 month before his arrest, he threw out about 50 pounds worth of the bags because he had lost his job and did not have any money and would have to move out, and thus was doing house cleaning and had to get rid of the parts. He then mentioned painting the skulls, Miller's, Cashty's, and Sears, 3 skulls, painted them in artificial color in case anyone saw them. One individual from Chicago, one of the victims, did see the skulls, and Mr. Dahmer said they were artificial. The next individual was David Thomas, black, met it on the streets, did not know his name, while waiting for a bus, 1 in the morning, offered him money, sexually propositioned him. Usually after making a pass, the person agreed. Quote, a hit or miss, unquote, situation was sometimes turned down at bars. Then I asked him, he's talking about making passes on the streets. And I asked him, he said, he said he was never hit by a person on the street after a pass. And a few times he was told to scram, etc. One time he was hit with a beer can and knocked out and kicked in the ribs. And he said this happened at his second apartment. And I asked him about this, and he said after his arrest for enticing a child, he moved out of his second apartment and was living with grandmother. He thought his former apartment would be empty, so he went back there with this individual, but someone had moved in. So he went to the basement of the apartment building with this individual, and while there he was attacked with a beer can. He was hospitalized overnight and had stitches in his head. Mr. Dahmer had stitches in his head. He told the police he was mugged. And I asked him about any other repercussions from his behavior, and he said the second time he was ever attacked was while on work release, and he did not go home for Thanksgiving dinner because, quote, he was too embarrassed to go home, unquote. His relatives were there, including his father. Instead, he went to bars and drank nearly a whole bottle of Yukon Jack and was, quote, extremely drunk, unquote. He was picked up by an older man, and they went to this older man's apartment, and then he, Mr. Dahmer, was, quote, hog-tied, unquote, and the other individual engaged in, quote, strange sexual bondage acts, unquote, with Mr. Dahmer. Mr. Dahmer started yelling and was let down and ran off and returned to the Huber dorm, quote, very drunk and very late. He was kept back from work for 2 days because of being late.
This was an aside that he went into as you were discussing the David Thomas case with him. Is that true?
That's true.
And it went back in time, this aside where he related that he had been victimized himself a couple of times. He's going back in time what was transpiring earlier before the Thomas case. Is that accurate?
True.
And then you resumed discussing the Thomas case with him.
Yes.
Did he feel, did he express from how he had been victimized, particularly the man that had hogtied him, and did he express anger at that happening, or any expression of
Yes, I think he was quite upset with that individual.
that the man had done that to him?
Yes.
You then continued talking, you resumed the discussion about David Thomas, is that correct?
They returned to Mr. Dahmer's apartment, gave Mr. Thomas a drink mixture, strangled him. Quote, same scenario, which were Mr. Dahmer's words, unquote. Then changed his routine. He said, quote, I wanted to cut down on the chances of anyone discovering me, unquote. So he then bought 2 heavy-duty trash barrels with a cap in the cover to pour in the acid. He did save Thomas's skull, said it was a, quote, safer way to dispose of the remains, unquote. And if I remember correctly here, he was kind of shifting from a trash bag program to a acidification program. Said all previous bones were kept for later reassembly. Later, quote, acidified, unquote, some sets of the bones, but kept the best set. And he called this the 27th Street bookstore case, Miller, for assembly. Oh, I then mentioned that he tried to dry out the skulls of Guerrero and the sheiks, 120 degrees in his oven. The water in the bones popped and spoiled the skulls and, quote, made them crumble, unquote. So he threw these 2 skulls away. He said there was nothing left of Thomas's body. He said this was the first time he took a picture of the abdomen split open, and he used the pictures for masturbation purposes. The next individual was Curtis Straughter. After a 2-week vacation, I don't know where he went, saw Straughter at a bus stop near Marquette, approached him, went to bars and drank, returned to the apartment and masturbated and had sex and watched videos. Then mentioned watching the video Exorcist 3, watched it frequently. Quote, I felt so evil and deprived by this time. The movie appealed to me. I related to it. I watched it before I went to bars and brought people back, unquote. Said he did not...
Well, if the word was deprived or depraved, if you recollect.
Well, I've got dictated deprived. I could look at my notes, it might have been depraved.
All right, go ahead.
Said he did not believe he was possessed by the devil, but said he did not understand what he was up to. In other words, being delusional about being possessed by the devil and committing behavior based on the devil made me do it, or this kind of stuff is a potential psychotic explanation for some behavior. So when people start talking about the occult and devils and demons, you want to make sure that it's not a psychotic manifestation.
But he said he was not possessed by the devil.
No, he was just talked, did not believe that. Strangled Straughter and defleshed him, saved his hands and genitals and kept them in formaldehyde, kept the skull, quote, for mementos and keepsakes, unquote. And he acidified the flesh and the bones, and this was the apparent second acidification procedure. And then I asked him, I commented that he was apparently not interrupted during his routines. He said that the manager once knocked on the door about the smell. He let him in the apartment and showed him the freezer, told the manager that there was spoiled meat, and the manager believed him, said he would take care of it right away. The body parts in the freezer looked like regular meat. Was never interrupted prior to or during the time of killing the victims. Like the phone ringing or something coming to the door. I don't even know if he had a phone. But he was never interrupted during that time. And I asked him what would it have taken to stop him from killing? And he said, quote, to agree to make it permanent, a longer commitment, unquote, again reflecting a relationship. Said the apartment smell was always an issue or concern for him, from the acid barrels and the odor from the trash barrels. Said by Tuesday or Wednesday following the Saturday night, early Sunday morning pickup, he would have to dispose of the parts in the barrels. He understood he would not then be able to pick up somebody the following weekend because of parts being in the barrels, that they might have to soak for a while. Would then substitute by going to the bathhouses in Chicago or use videos or pictures. He said he was also working 6 days a week and was tired. He said it was, quote, a tiring process to buy acid and dismember, time-consuming in the cleanup, unquote. By this time, he was clearly implying to me that the work was getting to him and starting to maybe deter him a little bit. It was clearly a negative drawback with his procedure. He said he would have to buy new acid.
Can I ask just one point about, in terms of control, what are the implications, if any, in terms of control, that if there's a body there at the house, he can alternatively choose to go to Chicago? Does that have any implications to you in connection with
Right,
control?
it's a outside contributing factor that if that was the circumstances, then he would exercise control as to when and where he carried out his sexual desires, and if he had, if things were going on at home and it was not timely to do it, then he would wait. He said he would have to buy new acid, 4 gallons for each barrel, muriatic, the only acid he would purchase, and it worked and he used it. He once tried sulfuric acid, but it was so strong that it made a cloud in the room and made the barrel hot. I then asked him to kind of summarize the cycle of events that he would go through, and he said that after using the body for sexual purposes, he would then be involved for a couple weeks with the use of the body parts and then the storage and the cleanup. Said he was often, quote, too tired or, quote, didn't have the time, unquote, to find another victim. Again, fatigue and timeliness would allow him to refrain and control himself. During the, quote, interlude, unquote, said he did not have any planned times when he wanted to pick someone up again, just when he had the time, but admitted that the interest and desires were there. The next individual was Errol Lindsay, met on the streets during the daytime, black, quote, nice looking. He did it just for the money, unquote. A couple weeks before, I'd bought some handcuffs, quote, to avoid a potential struggle, a good safeguard, unquote. Lindsay was not gay, handcuffed his hands, said he, quote, wanted someone to stay around that was alive, unquote. Then he starts another phase. Well, I guess
Had he drugged Mr. Lindsay? Did you understand from the discussion that he had drugged Lindsay before he undertook the next step?
Yes. He used an electric drill and drilled a hole into the top of the skull and brain, filled a syringe with muriatic, muriatic acid. Quote, I didn't want to have to keep killing and just end up with a skull. So finally, the shortcomings of his routine are causing him to think about other alternatives. Did not strangle him, try to drill. Lindsay woke up, and then Mr. Dahmer injected one more time, woke up again, and Lindsay appeared somewhat normal, but said he had a headache. He was not handcuffed. Then gave him the drink mixture and strangled him. Took many pictures. Then said he wanted to save, quote, save something different, unquote. He laid the body on a plastic sheet on the bedroom floor and described how he was able to peel the skin off. He tried to preserve it as another memento, but eventually he had to, didn't work out, and he had to acidify the flesh and the bones and the skin, but he did save the skull. The next individual was Tony Hughes, again met at the 219 Club after closing. Mr. Hughes could not hear. They wrote notes and shared hand signals. Returned to the apartment and gave him the drink mixture. Said he, Mr. Dahmer, was quote, was very drunk, unquote, again reflecting the role of intoxication. So drunk apparently that he did not remember giving him the drink mixture, did not remember strangling him. Implied that he was, quote, pretty drunk. I woke up and he was dead, unquote. Said he was, quote, too tired, unquote, to do any dismemberment. Kept the body in the bedroom and the bathroom floor for 3 days. And when asked, said he had anal intercourse with about half of the victims, quote, just if I was in the mood, unquote. Said he did not like anal intercourse being done to him, but sometimes enjoyed doing it to others or to a body. Next, mentioned Conrack. They met at the mall. Quote, he caught my eye, unquote, propositioned him with $50. Conrack was undecided. Quote, he appeared older to me, did not know. Scratched it.
Right. He did not know that there was a certain relationship that of another individual with whom he had had contact. Is that correct?
True.
If I may advise the jury, that touches on the stipulation which was shared with you the other day, but not publicized.
Returned to the apartment, took 2 pictures, drank, tried the drill and acid techniques, meaning drilling a hole and injecting acid into the skull. Later in the evening, wanted some more beer and left the apartment. In the police reports, the statement that Conrack was still passed out, and so Mr. Dahmer decided to go out for a beer. He said he had 1 beer and left at closing time and returned to the apartment.
Referring back to your notes now, you injected a comment from the police confession, and now going
right.
back to your notes. Is
Back
that
to my
correct?
notes.
This is what Mr. Dahmer told you about it.
Yep, had one beer and left at closing time and returned to the apartment. Conrack was on State Street sitting on the curb unclothed. Some women were there, told the woman that he was a friend and that he, Conrack, had walked out of the apartment. The police came. Conrack did not speak English and did not want to go back to the apartment, but the 2 claimed that the 2 policemen took him under each arm and helped him back to the apartment. Inside the apartment, he claimed that the police officers saw the 2 pictures of Conrack in his underwear. Said that Hugh's body was on the floor in the bedroom at the time. Said Conrack was not bleeding through the hole in his head. There was no anal intercourse before he left to get some more beer. Conrack was not bleeding from anywhere when he was outside. The police left, gave Conrack a second injection of acid and killed him. Was disappointed, unquote, that Conrack died and that the injection technique was not successful, meaning that he was trying to keep somebody alive, have a sexual partner that was alive but willing and docile and under his control, but alive so he would not have to bother with the cleanup and killing people. Took some pictures and had anal intercourse. The next day put both Conrack and Hughes in the tub and defleshed them, kept both heads. First time he ever had parts from 2 individuals in the barrels. Said no one was ever suspicious of his buying the acid at the hardware store, $2.50 per gallon. Thought Conrack was about 16 years old.